certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
A critical sample of Ciara Glennon's hair sent interstate and overseas was at one point initialled by a leading DNA analyst who was later sacked for breaching testing protocols over a 6-year period. Welcome to Claremont in Conversation. Natalie Bonjolo here with the West Australian's reporters Tim Clarke and Emily Moulton. Well, it was actually an interesting start to the day because no sooner had you started that court was adjourned.
Yes, there was a technical glitch in terms of the subscribing services. So for those who aren't familiar, what happens in court is there's someone transcribing everything that is heard at a very fast rate. I'm not sure how they do it. But there is a person. We all discussed it today when this happened. Though we were so no, there is someone that's doing it. So, so that pretty much happened, I think, within 20 minutes of court starting. Justice Hall basically told the court that he'd received a notice saying that they have been unable to record this morning's proceedings, and so he said that they had to adjourn. So we adjourned, and I think it was over 2 hours, I think it was adjourned for. And when he came back, he sort of informed the court that it wasn't just that courtroom, it was the entire building that was having problems, but they've worked out a system so that they can record inside the court, and then those recordings would then be given to the transcribers after to I guess, produce a transcript which the counsel for both the prosecution and defence get access to look at, just to go over what was said and prepare, if they need to come back and question it or have a legal issue they want to raise, they can go back to the transcript and refer to that, as well as sort of where their helpers are taking notes as well.
What do court reporters do when court shuts down for 2 or 3 hours? Where do you all go?
Breathe a sigh of relief for a little while, especially in this case. I personally stayed inside the media room just with a few others, and I think we have been lucky enough to have access to the transcript as well. So I know everyone was sort of taking advantage of that time to mine the transcript, go back and check anything that they want to double check, and did a bit of browsing online, reading up on all the other news of the day, and familiarising yourself with everything else that's happening in the world, because I think we're in this little bubble where all that matters is Claremont, and that's all we sort of read about and know about and all we talk about and all the only questions we get asked about as well. So
yeah, it was a little bit of revision as well, Matt, because we know we're just about to enter a very technical and forensic portion of the trial, which is going to be the largest portion of the trial. And so going back to the opening statements and basically refreshing yourself as to exhibit numbers and what was, what is to come. And as it turned out, it was quite a useful time spent, because we did get to exhibit numbers and journeys and where certain exhibits were on certain days in certain countries as well. So it was time well spent, because there'll be a lot of referencing to different exhibit numbers and trying to stay across which one is which and where it was at what particular time is going to be quite important.
Well, very commendable and diligent of you both. You could have gone shopping, but you didn't. And I guess, like you just said, once you did get underway today, there was a timeline. You only had one witness today to go through, and this was a really interesting forensic journey today, wasn't it?
Yeah. So a chap called Gary Hyde, who was one of the forensic team that was involved in macro from very early on, to many years in. He was his first major role, I suppose, was being at the Ciara Glennon crime scene, and then the following day he took the photographs at Ciara's post-mortem, which is obviously a critically important role, liaising very closely with the pathologist who's doing the post-mortem and recording everything and anything that they want recorded. It was over 70 photographs he took that day, and then he returned a couple of days later when the pathologist returned to do some more examinations of Ciara's body. And then we found out that over the years, it was Mr. Hyde, Sergeant Hyde, who was tasked with both sending off and receiving very important exhibits surrounding Ciara's hair and her hair mass, as they referred it to, which is the main body of the hair that was taken from the body during the post-mortem and bagged up. And that hair has been on a very long and winding journey itself, including to America, where it went to the FBI in 1999, came back to Australia in the year 2000, and then several years later it then went to Canberra, where the Australian Federal Police is based, and their hair and fibre expert had a look at it, and it was there for over 2 years, and then it came back to Perth again in 2005, where it did eventually go into storage for many, many years. And so Sergeant Hyde, whose job it was to get that sample ready for dispatch to America, and then when it did come back from the AFP, it was his job to open up the boxes and check everything that was in those boxes against the list of exhibits that went. And so we know, obviously, how important continuity and who has handled what samples and when is in this trial because of the possible sources of contamination. So he was the first witness to detail how it went and how it came back and all his interactions in between.
So it sort of started, I guess, sort of going back to when, like, the first part of this morning before he adjourned, it sort of started off with how he first became involved in this investigation. He was asked to go to Jane Rimmer's flat after she'd been reported missing. So he was there as part of the forensic team who photographed her apartment in Wembley and her car. So he sort of spoke about that and the photographs, and in particular, which sort of came up later on in the day, was about the hairbrush that they took from her bathroom cabinet. So that was sort of one of the exhibits that later on they discussed that was in that box that he opened up later when it was returned from the AFP in 2005. So that hairbrush was still there in a sealed bag after it had been tested by the AFP. So he sort of talked about how they collected it and was asked to very painstakingly go through the running sheet of what they did, who did that and who ticked off that. So we heard a lot about that. And then sort of when it moved from then, he was next involved, as Tim said before, being at Ciara Glennon's crime scene. And one of the things that I clapped on when he mentioned, when he was asked what he was wearing, one of the things he said, we were wearing like the light blue overalls, the Yakka overalls. And one of the things we heard in the opening was the issue of the Telstra technician uniforms, which were made by Yakka, that have the blue fibres. And so Carmel Barbagello sort of asked twice, saying, what colour were the overalls? And he said light blue. So what we've heard is blue uniforms, and I think from memory they're sort of like, I don't know if you'd call them dark blue, but I guess workwear from that time was that kind of blue uniform. So anyway, so he sort of said that, so he was wearing that, and then he was asked about sort of dealing with the samples from Ciara that day and what his role was on that day. And then we moved to the boxes, and I think the first mention was in July, and correct me if I'm wrong, 1999? No, it was February 1999 that he first went to Path West to collect exhibits, and those exhibits were then sent to the US to the FBI. So, and then from there, they sort of flicked back and forth between this particular, which they referred to as the hair mass from Ciara Glennon. So they went from 1999, and then they went to 2005. But then we know that before 2005, the actual samples were sent to the AFP in 2003, and that's something we heard from the opening. But then also that they kept. Then after they returned in 2005, they were actually kept in storage until 2018 in WA.
Yes, it's a very complex and woven timeline. And, we do keep hearing about these blue fibres. And, of course, everyone who takes the stand is asked exactly what they were wearing to the scenes. And that's, it's a tricky thing because, Yakka, anyone who doesn't know Yakka workwear, it's hugely iconic. It's, it's a massive Australian brand. By the 1970s, if you worked in any industry, you'd be wearing sort of almost blue Yakka workwear. And, of course, this blue fibre is from a pair of, Yakka workwear.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, it is critical now, and it's going to become even more important as we do delve into this fibre evidence. What the prosecution say is it can't be from any other type of Yakka workwear, because Yakka made a particular type of blue fibre that the work pants and shorts indeed.
I think they called it Telstra Navy or T-Navy.
In fact, yes, it was. It was called T-Navy or Telstra Navy. So it was their particular type of blue. But that is going to become extremely important, because if the prosecution can nail it down to that it had to be from Telstra pants, then obviously any other potential source is blown out of the water. And as you said, Nat, Yakka there would be thousands of miles of Yakka fabric in wardrobes, drawers, and workplaces all over Australia, because they are pretty omnipotent when it comes to workwear, and did indeed have many contracts for many major corporations, including Telstra, in the 90s. And so that is why this seemingly innocuous question of what you were wearing on what day takes on a whole new importance. And then particularly when a witness says, yes, I was wearing blue Yakka overalls, then obviously that would pique the interest of the defence very much.
Okay, well, if you can take us back to Gary Hyde's evidence today, and he goes to the burial site of Ciara Glennon, and just tell us, what path he follows from there in following through that whole process right through to post-mortem and what have you.
Yeah, well, so he was one of the very few forensic officers at the scene. He was,
I think, actually
important there.
The first thing he said that when he got there, he was tasked to go take aerial photographs. So he went up in the police chopper to do that. And so he spent that first part when all the forensic team arrived, he sort of said, like, I spent that first part up in the air taking the photos. And then when he came down, which he said was roughly between sort of 1:30, then he was asked to sort of record the running sheet, and I'm sure that's sort of been discussed before, and we've heard it quite a lot over the last few weeks. The running sheet are what the police use to record their movements. Like every time someone enters the scene, it's recorded, and so he said his responsibility that day was to make those recordings on the running sheet. The normal question that everyone who was at the crime scene is asked is, how close did you get to the body? And he said no more than 2 metres. So he was saying he didn't need to, because he was there just recording. He never touched the body. That he also was asked that. And then he was sort of asked about recording the different exhibits. And there's been a lot of discussion over one exhibit number called RH17, which is a hair sample from Ciara Glennon, which I think if you... at another earlier sort of in the trial, they talked about how when the video was being played, there was like a 3-minute gap, and the taking of that hair sample wasn't filmed. So there's been, I think, sort of today, the prosecution was trying to establish that where this hair sample was. So he sort of was then reading out from the exhibit list and sort of went through the different sort of preceding and following numbers. And sort of he'd read out R17 hair sample head. But when he was asked if he could remember it being taken, he said he couldn't. And one of the, I guess, things today with Sergeant Hyde was that Justice Hall actually specifically asked him, especially when it came to the boxes as well, if he had an independent recollection of his involvement in that. And he said no, he can only really remember things from the aid of the running sheets and photographs he'd seen. over the years and in preparation for the trial.
It's been very noted that Mr. Jovich at any point that he feels that the witness is not trying to remember independently, but is relying too much on the written notes, and he is always asking, can you please ask the witness to exhaust their independent recollection before they refer to their notes. So Mr. Jovich is making all the witnesses exhaust their memory banks before they turn to their notebooks.
And just maybe recap for us why RH17 is so crucial.
So that's one of 4 hair samples, separate hair samples, obviously all from the same place, from Ciara's head, but they were, over the years, they've been sampled and subsampled. But RH17 is important because that was the one that was taken in situ on the day before Ciara had even been moved into the vehicle that was then to take her to the mortuary. It was placed in a yellow top container, which was sealed up, and the word pristine has been used by Miss Bonjolo about that hair sample. So it hasn't gone on this journey to America and to Canberra and back again, and through all these different pairs of hands. That RH17 sample was basically taken and wasn't touched until it was examined many, many years later and was found to contain one of these blue fibres. So where it originated from, who touched it from, and who placed it or who took it from Ciara and put it into that pot, those 3 minutes of missing video, if not for them, we would know, obviously, but for whatever reason, it wasn't filmed, and so every witness who was at that scene and involved with the taking of those exhibits has been asked and will be asked whether they can recollect who took it and what happened to it after that.
So Mr. Hyde then goes from in situ. He goes to the mortuary and he is there also for the post-mortem.
Yeah, he was the photographer. That was his role at during the post-mortem examination of Ciara Glennon's body, and he said that while he was there, like as the previous officer who was there for Jane Rimmer's post-mortem explained, that they're being directed by the pathologist about what photos to take, and so that's what sort of he was there. And then afterwards he also collected the exhibits, but he didn't have any. But that he didn't actually collect the exhibits, but that he assisted in documenting them, so writing down on the piece of paper. They did 2 post-mortems, so then he returned a few days later, where they did sort of more examinations on Ciara's body, and sort of after that, the question sort of turned to jumping sort of to 1999. He told that his next involvement was basically going to the PAS Centre in Netherlands and picking up these exhibits, which were then sent to the US.
And this is the same exhibits?
Taken from the post-mortem.
Taken from the post-mortem,
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so, and we know from the opening statement that they were actually sent to the FBI, and so that hair mass sample that was collected that day was given a number, and then a subsample was taken from that, and that was given an identifier called K1, which the state says becomes a critical exhibit in their opinion. And they said an examination of that sample was carried out, and there was one critical fibre was located off that hair sub-sample, and it was a blue polyester fibre. And sort of during today's proceedings, when Miss Bonjolo asked him what those exhibits were when they were sent off, he said that one was labelled hair mass, and the other one was labelled DNA sample Williams, which we assume was Lance Williams, the man that the Macro Task Force believed at that time may have been a suspect. And then at the bottom of it, it's just initialed LW. And then Miss Bonjolo asked him, what's LW stand for? And then he said, Laurie Webb, who was, as we know, in charge of Path West at the time.
Okay, so can you give us and this is quite interesting and is obviously important to the defence case and to the prosecution's case. Can you talk to us a little bit about Laurie Webb?
So Laurie Webb was the the boss of Pathwest. He was the lead forensic scientist. It was he that was in charge of the processes and the ensuring that the exhibits and samples that came to Pathwest and were stored at Pathwest were done in up to critical standards and standards that could stand the test of the criminal justice system. So the reason Laurie Webb's initials would have been on the bottom of that sample is that he would have been the Pathwest officer responsible for handing them back to the police so they could then take them or send them over to America. And Mr. Webb's name is going to crop up in various stages because of his seniority at Pathwest, and because of obviously the critical nature of all the exhibits that were stored there. It was he that was in charge, as I've mentioned in a previous podcast. In fact, it was Mr. Webb personally, along with a police officer, who was tasked with taking the DNA samples from Ciara's fingernails to the UK and to have them tested by Forensic Science Service over there, which we know produced the critical DNA sample, which is at the very heart of the case. Several years ago, it became quite a significant scandal in the WA criminal justice system because Mr. Webb was basically removed and sacked from his post at Pathwest because of supposed shortcuts that he had been taking in the documentation and the analysis and process of keeping exhibits. There was a double testing procedure that had to be done. So when the exhibits were logged and stored and documented, there had to be a double stock take or a double ticking of all the boxes to make sure that they were where they said they were and had been for the time that they were there. Various exhibits, not just macro exhibits, all sorts of exhibits. And Mr. Webb was eventually removed from his post because it was found in various investigations that double bagging of the evidence, if you like, the double checking of the evidence wasn't being done. And so there were, from memory, over 30 criminal cases, in some cases very serious and criminal cases that had to be placed under scrutiny. The evidence that had been presented before the court was placed under scrutiny because the checkbox, the ticking off of the evidence hadn't been done up to the proper standards. I don't think, in fact, I'm sure that no criminal convictions have actually been overturned because of that oversight, but it was obviously serious enough for Mr. Webb to be removed from his very senior post at Pathwest, which he'd held for a long time, and certainly it caused serious waves in political circles. The opposition Attorney General at the time, John Quigley, who was now the Attorney General, was very critical of Mr. Webb and what it had meant to investigations, which had to be thoroughly checked over.
Yeah, I mean, it was extraordinary and it was unprecedented at the time. And just for listeners, so the times that we're talking about, this happened when Laurie Webb was sacked, basically. This happened in 2016, and the cases that Tim's talking about is between 2008 and 2014. And, of course, the sample that you're talking about that he personally handled is in 2012.
Yes, yeah. Correct. So it's right in that timeline, and obviously, Mr. Webb will become a crucial witness a long-standing witness. I'm sure he will be on the stand for many, many days, both from the prosecution side and certainly from the defence side, because regardless of anything else, the fact that he was the man who took these fingernail samples to the UK in these precious samples where they were tested with FSS, came back positive for a mixed DNA profile, including a man, and then brought them back to Path West with those results in hand. I mean, that in itself will be a major part of this trial, and everything that he did, along with the police officer who accompanied him, what they did in those days and weeks will become absolutely vital.
And I think from memory, Carmel Barbagallo, in her opening, she sort of, obviously defence brought this up, but she said at the time that any suggestion that there was this cross-contamination in that period was just fantasy.
Yeah, well, she could not have been stronger in her opening statement in the suggestion that this particularly the fingernail sample might have somehow been contaminated. She said it was fantasy.
Errant fantasy, I think.
Yeah, errant fantasy. She said that DNA doesn't just fly around the laboratory. There would had to have been an extraordinary breakdown in protocols for one exhibit to come in contact with another exhibit from a completely different case, from a completely different timeline. And again, rereading the opening this week, something that I'd heard but probably hadn't really come to grips with, is she also said, so the allegation, or it would appear that the allegation is going to be that the samples taken during the Karrakatta rape investigation, which we know contain Mr. Edwards' DNA, have somehow come into contact with the Ciara Glennon samples. But what Miss Barbagallo said in her opening was that if that had been the case, then the DNA of the Karrakatta victim should also have turned up when it was tested in the UK, because there is no possible way that just one part of that DNA sample could have come into contact. If it had come into contact, then both sets of DNA would have been transferred, which I think is, I probably hadn't grasped the importance of that point so many weeks ago, but rereading it this week, that really jumped out at me as a very logical and possibly very strong argument. And so when the doctors from FSS give evidence, whenever that might be, in several months' time, probably, that will obviously be a very hot point of contention as to whether, if contamination was able to take place, could it possibly be that just part of that DNA could be transferred over?
It's a very interesting question for our forensic expert who will be on tomorrow, Brendan Chapman.
Yes.
I think we'll have a lot for him to try and, help us wade through here, because I just feel it is getting quite complex with just looking at the numbers, the RHs and the
HAM and K1, V1, VW1. There's lots of different numbers. And the thing that I've sort of been able to sort of go back and reread, like the opening statement, is that the different numbers are actually, some of them are still talking about the same thing, but they're just given a different number as the investigation progresses. So that makes it more confusing, because it goes from AJ54 to VM, and then RH1 then goes to like K1 or something. It just, it gets confusing.
No. We will promise to try and keep it as clear for the listeners as we can. But it is going to be complex, and it is going to be complicated, but we know from the questions and the emails that we're getting every day, Nat, that the listeners are fully engaged with the case as we are. So
they're very astute.
We'll try and keep it as clear and as precise as we can.
Well, we do have a couple of listeners' questions. You bring me to that point. Now, these are variations of similar questions which we keep getting. So we'll sort of just pick one that sums up various people's questions. This one's from Tanya. Were Mr. and Mrs. Cook And we might just remind people that Mr. and Mrs. Cook were the couple that Bradley Edwards was supposed to be having a weekend getaway with and failed to show until the next morning. It has been said that Ciara in particular had massive defensive wounds to the point on her thumb now being partially torn off. So her question is, did the Cooks or were the Cooks not asked about whether Bradley Edwards had any, obvious wounds?
Obvious wounds.
I can't remember, but I don't know. Can you remember?
I don't think that question was asked.
I don't recall it.
I don't think that question was asked, but I am sure that if Mr. and Mrs. Cook had seen some sort of defensive or some sort of obvious injury on Mr. Edwards, that it would have been in one of their statements. I cannot believe that the police would not have asked them about that at the time and afterwards, because that would just be a basic investigative query. You would have thought. So I think the simple answer would be they weren't asked because it wasn't in their statement.
And Bridget has a question. She also talked about the night that Ciara Glennon went missing. We know that Bradley Edwards didn't show for this weekend getaway until the next morning. But she asks, does he have alibis for the nights that Sarah Spears and Jane Rimmer disappeared? I know you've sort of answered these through the course of the trial, but if you can just recap where he says he was at the time.
Well, so the
Sarah was straight A.
Yeah. So for Sarah's disappearance, January 27, he was said to be or claimed to be down south visiting his wife. Is that am I right there, Em?
Yeah, that was. I think that was the night that the fireworks that his first wife couldn't recall.
So Em's exactly right there. So it's short answer is he as from what we've heard so far, Mr. Edwards cannot account for that time when Sarah went missing. He was down south with supposedly trying to reconcile with his wife, was rebuffed on the fireworks night, and then was at work at some stage early the next day. So we have not heard any alibi from Mr. Edwards' defence team, either in the opening or any suggestion during any of the questioning. And that's the same for the night that Jane went missing. We haven't heard anything from the defence side or any hint of any possible alibi for the night that Jane went missing either.
And I guess as we keep hearing that, the onus is not upon them to prove his innocence. Mm-hmm. It's all depending on prosecution to be able to show that beyond reasonable doubt.
Correct, Nat. But I think Damien's touched on it previously in a previous podcast. When it comes to alibis, the rules there are slightly different. If you do intend to use an alibi, then there is an agreement that you have got to give some sort of notice to the prosecution, so that they are then placed in a position whereby if they want to disprove it or can disprove it, they can. I'm pretty sure that's the case, but we'll park that one for the listeners and maybe revisit it when we speak to Damien again next week.
So that's another one for Damien's list. That pile is growing as well with all of the questions that are coming in. So if you do want to talk to us or contact us, it's claremontpodcast@wanews.com.au. If you want any more information on the Claremont serial killings trial, head to thewest.com.au. And I believe, was there an exhibits released today if listeners wanted to?
There was just one picture of Claremont back in the day, which was taken by Mr. Hyde. He was dispatched out there after midnight one night to take some pictures of the Claremont Strip, particularly Stirling Highway, to show what sort of lighting was in place at the time, just to obviously give the judge another view of Claremont, although it was actually Justice Stephen Hall who was telling the photographer which part of Claremont he was in, rather than the other way round. So familiar is the judge alone with the area.
With the area. Well, if you would like to see that picture, you can see that on the website. That's thewest.com.au. Thank you both for your time.
No worries.
We'll be back tomorrow for day 26 of Claremont in Conversation, and we hope you can join us then.
This podcast was hosted by Natalie Bonjolo, produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy, and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
Enjoying this podcast? If the story behind the headline matters to you, then you can count on thewest.com.au to deliver. For more on Claremont the trial, follow the live blog, watch the nightly news updates, and sign up for daily email updates at thewest.com.au. Subscribe now for just $1 a day at thewest.com.au.